Call the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, Madam Speaker, once again we see the extraordinary hypocrisy of the Australian Labor Party. Once again we see the man who's meant to be the alternative Prime Minister of this country stand at the dispatch box and make comments about what he believes to be fair and unfair, and to slander those on this side of the chamber. And for what purpose? For the single purpose that the Australian Labor Party is unwilling to confront the truth about their legacy. Now, we on this side of the chamber understand Labor's legacy. We on this side of the chamber perhaps are more willing to be up front with the Australian people about the challenges that we as a nation face. But not the Australian Labor Party. They want to bury underneath the carpet their legacy. They want to pretend that the problems that they've bequeathed not only to this government but also to future generations of Australians don't exist, and in fact possibly the person with the most invested in the betrayal of the Australian people is none other than the opposition leader. And that's the reason why, Madam Speaker, we see the Australian Labor Party stand up and rail about the unfairness of the budget. But the fact is, there is no bigger unfairness on the national debate across the country right now than the unfairness that the Australian Labor Party says, which is we would rather leave to future generations of Australian children all of the problems of paying back the multi-billion dollars of debt and deficit than we would face up to the reality. Now, we as a government are proud of this budget. We're proud of this budget because this budget actually does have the right priorities, because they are anchored around one central tenet. And that central tenet is that we can only afford to do what we can afford to achieve in terms of our fiscal priorities. We can only undertake reforms if we can pay for them. We can only undertake policy spending if we can pay for it. We can only engage in new initiatives if there's a way to pay for it. And if there isn't an ability to raise the money necessary, it is not appropriate to say it's good enough to kick the can down the road. It isn't appropriate to say to Australian children, we don't care what the impact is going to be on you, because we're going to undertake this particular proposal because we think there's a few votes in it. That's Labor's approach. That's not the coalition approach. That is not our approach, and we will stand in this chamber each and every day and defend decisions that we know are not the most popular decisions. We didn't undertake this budget reform process because we thought it was going to make us 55-45 in the polls. No. We undertook these decisions because these are decisions that are in the national interest. We undertook these decisions because these are decisions that are financially sustainable. We undertook these decisions because we know in the long term the Australian people can see through the salesmanship of the Australian Labor Party. They can see through the falseness of the outrage, the confected outrage that we see from Labor members opposite, and they fundamentally know this, that no promise from the Australian Labor Party is worth anything if they can't afford to pay for it. And that's the reason why, as a government, to tackle the fact that we have an ageing population, to address the fact that we have a tax base that, relative to the size of the population, is getting smaller, we have said one of our very top priorities must be investment in infrastructure. And the Prime Minister has made it clear that he wants to be remembered as an infrastructure Prime Minister, and he will be, Mr Deputy Speaker. He will be because, as a government, together with the private sector and together with state government partners, we will allocate $125 billion into productive infrastructure for this nation. Now, compare the coalition's approach to infrastructure with that of the previous Labor government. $125 billion into productive infrastructure across the nation, the East-West link, the Gateway duplication, the expansion on the northern side of the Gateway Bridge in Brisbane, the freight route in Perth. There are a whole host of projects. Compare that to Labor's grand infrastructure project, and perhaps none was more grand than building the education revolution. Who could forget Labor's $16 billion vision? The $16 billion Building the Education Revolution vision, which saw school halls rolled out across the country, covered outdoor learning centres rolled out across the country. I mean, sure, There were a couple of examples of where schools already had one and they didn't want another one, but that didn't matter. That got in the way of Labor's grand vision. Sure, there were a couple of examples of where the Australian Labor Party, through their haste to run up this program, were paying 2 or 3 times the going rate of what was expected. But that didn't matter. It's just taxpayers' money. They don't need to worry about that. And of course, we see the Australian Labor Party's approach with their $900 cash splash. And again, Labor said, look, there's some wastage, sure, but don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's necessary. But the fact is that it's now left to this generation and to future generations to pay back all of that spending. And when Labor stands up and say they stand opposed to this government making reforms around, for example, the pensions, what they're actually saying is we will sacrifice the future generations of Australians, we will make them pay that debt back for decades in order to secure ourselves a couple of extra votes today. That's Labor's central message. And as a government, we will not stand idly by. So I say to the Australian Labor Party on behalf of the Coalition, we will stare you down in every single debate, because there's one thing that we know, and that is good fiscal governance. And we know that we do it better than Labor. And if you ever wanted any example of that, Mr Deputy Speaker, look no further than the facts, because the Australian Labor Party is very big on rhetoric but very poor on action. We know over 500 times they promised to deliver a budget surplus, but how many did they deliver? Not one. We know that the Australian Labor Party, in the former Treasurer, the member for Lilly, stood here at this very dispatch box in 2012 and said the 4 years of surplus I announced tonight, only to deliver 4 more years of deficit. $123 billion of deficit, $667 billion of gross debt. That's Labor's legacy. And all of the huffing and puffing from the Leader of the Opposition and from Labor members opposite will never undo one fundamental fact, that debt trajectory, the fastest growing level of spending in the 17 developed nations monitored by the IMF, the fastest growth rate of debt basically on the face of the planet, that was Labor's legacy at a time when our terms of trade were among some of the best this nation has ever seen.
140-year high.
And we know that with Labor's approach today, with the actual policies that Labor continues to espouse today, they would sacrifice the future by ensuring that we have another 4 years of budget deficits, which would mean that as a nation we have had 10 years of budget deficits, the longest single period of budget deficits in over 45 years since budget records were kept in 1971. That's Labor's approach. And that's the reason why, as a coalition government, we are committed to economic reform, we're committed to productive infrastructure, and we're committed to being upfront and frank with the Australian people and saying, we know not everything we say is good news, but you know what? It's the truth. It's the truth. And we know that we will always be level with the Australian people and tell them what we can afford and what we can't afford. And Labor's approach, Labor's shonky snake oil salesman approach that says, don't worry about it, we'll kick the can down the road, the only thing that approach will bequeath are Australian kids that are poorer tomorrow than they are today. And it might be acceptable for the Australian Labor Party to say, well, we don't care about $25,000 of debt for every man, woman and child. We don't care that an Australian family of 4 will have a starting point of being $100,000 in debt thanks to Labor's policies. But we in the Coalition, we do care. And we will not stand by and allow that failed Labor Party approach to continue, because we saw the consequences of 6 years of Labor ineptitude when it comes to good governance, and we as a coalition government may not always do what's popular, but we as a coalition government will always do what's right. And in the fullness of time, I would rather go to the electorate every day of every week, Mr Deputy Speaker, every day of every week, and look them in the eye and say to them, we make decisions because they're the right decisions in the national interest, and we prioritise the right kind of spending and not the kinds of cash splashes which might in the short term be a nice little sugar hit and which might in the short term garner up a couple extra votes for the Australian Labor Party, but which in the long term actually betray the single most important trust the Australian people put in us, which is the future of their children.